Good afternoon and welcome to the Michigan Political Science Association's annual meeting. My name is Dave Dulio. I'm a professor of political science at Oakland University. I'm also a member of the MIPSA Executive Board. The Michigan Political Science Association is one of the oldest continuously active state organizations in our field. This year's conference is MIPSA's 53rd. It's the second to be held virtually. This panel is being recorded and will be posted on the MIPSA website at a later date. You may wish to keep your camera off, and I encourage you to stay muted until we reach the end of the portion of the session where we'll have Q&A from the audience. With that, we'll turn it over to our two panelists for their presentations. We'll take 20 or so minutes each, and then have plenty of time for Q&A.
Okay, so first I'd like to thank John Clark for organizing this virtual meeting of MIPSA and giving us all an opportunity to share our ideas, our work, maybe talk a little bit about our experience in the last year teaching under conditions of COVID. It's really good to see old colleagues and friends. So the title of my talk is Presidential Populism in the Americas, and this is a paper that I'm co-authoring with Richard Stoller-Schulk, whom some of you know. And the way that we began studying this topic is we co-teach a class called Poverty, Human Rights, and Health. It's an interdisciplinary course with a study abroad component that surveys the social science literature on inequality and examines implications of inequality for human rights, and then focuses especially on the human right to health. So when the COVID pandemic began last year, we were teaching this course, and we would start each class with news articles about how different states were responding to COVID. And we noticed really quickly that three presidents in the world really stood out, and that their approach to COVID was quite similar. And these three presidents were Trump, Bolsonaro of Brazil, and Andres Lopez Obrador of Mexico. And so we kind of said, well, why? Why do we see them behaving the same way? So all of them denied the reality of the pandemic or downplayed the threat of the virus. They clashed with their own epidemiologists and public health experts and refused to implement national lockdowns. They would not wear masks or adhere to social distancing recommendations. Instead, they continued to hold rallies, dive into crowds, and hug their supporters. Bolsonaro and Trump even touted unproven cures. They were both big fans of hydroxychloroquine. In all three cases, the president's response to the pandemic undermined the ability of their states to mitigate it and arguably caused considerable harm to their people. So why did they do this? And why do we see a similar pattern in the three countries? So kind of digging a little deeper, it became really clear that they have very similar approach to leadership, which is really this kind of populist approach. All three of them have depicted themselves as outsiders and champions of the people, battling the political establishment to advance the popular will. As presidents, they have resisted institutional and legal checks on their power. So are they all populists? Are they indeed populists? And if so, how can we explain the emergence of populist presidents in countries with such distinctly different cultures and patterns of historical development? So that's kind of where we began and with the questions. And we dived into this literature on populism to kind of see whether they do in fact fit the populist pattern, and then to think about what the implications of that might be for understanding what's happening in the Western Hemisphere and in these specific countries. So first of all, what is populism? So there's a huge and growing literature on populism, and there's some varied interpretations, definitions of populism. But we understand populism to have both an ideological and a political strategic dimension. So as an ideology, populism envisions the world as divided into two antagonistic groups, the people versus the elites. The people are good and pure. Elites are evil and corrupt. Democracy, which should express the people's will, is argued by populists to have been subverted by the elite who use their positions in political, economic, and social institutions to enrich and empower themselves and their allies at the people's expense. So populism as an ideology, it's very adaptable. It can really be applied to almost any context. You just change the identities of the major actors and change the story to fit the political and historical context. And in terms of the kind of the political strategic dimension, populism is a strategy that personalistic leaders use to build support. So they build a kind of a style of leadership and a type of power that's based on direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized support from large numbers of mostly unorganized followers. So populists typically will circumvent established political parties or channels of connecting with the mass public. And in some cases, they may take over parties. So that's another strategy that's used by populists. Or they may build their own political party, but typically those parties are leader dominated. So that's a kind of core attribute of a populist movement or party. So then the leader calls on the people to join him, and it's almost always a man, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, in this kind of epic struggle to restore power to the people. And so this little graphic, I think, really depicts very well what populism is all about. It's this idea that the individual can embody the will of the people, and that you don't need any institutions or channels to make that happen, just this kind of direct personal relationship with the populist leader. So populism offers a kind of direct plebiscitary leadership as an alternative to existing elites and institutions, which are typically referred to as the establishment. So populists seem to be revolutionary and have an appeal because of the way in which they challenge the existing institutions. So populism has an ambivalent, ambiguous relationship to democracy. So in the contemporary period, most references to populism sort of assume an antagonism to democracy. But really, populism is kind of the flip side of democracy in a way, or one author sort of referred to it as democracy's shadow. And I've read so much about populism, I'm forgetting who sort of made that reference. But I like that metaphor of populism as democracy's shadow, because populism really arises when there's a lack of representation or a perception by significant subgroups of the population that their interests are not being represented. And to a considerable extent, populism is a perennial problem for democracy because it's rooted in the contradiction between liberalism's promise and the socioeconomic inequality of capitalist societies, which tends to often really undermine the kind of promise of formal equality or legal and juridical equality of all individuals. So there's a tension then in liberal democracies between the ideals of democracy and the reality of everyday life in a society that's highly unequal. So then another factor that can contribute to the rise of populism is crisis. And this is pretty extensively emphasized in the literature as well. So crises tend to overwhelm the capacity of governments to respond effectively, and thus they exacerbate the problem of weak representation or the perception of a lack of representation. And we may be living in an era of populism. In fact, the more that Rich and I have studied this, that's kind of where I am. I think we're going to see populism as the dominant kind of political, the dominant form of political leadership in the 21st century for a number of reasons. The tremendous socioeconomic inequality that's been generated by contemporary capitalism and the multiple interconnected crises that the world is facing right now. the crisis of the environment with climate change, the crisis of the pandemic, and hopefully there won't be other pandemics in the future, but we don't know that that will be so. And so populism, I think, is going to be with us for some period of time. And what we see in many countries, including in the United States and Brazil and Mexico, is a very high level of insecurity for the working and middle classes that's been generated by global economic inequality, and as well as rural communities. And that sense of insecurity has been definitely exacerbated in the period of the pandemic. So how populism affects democracy is really dependent on the socio-historical and political context and the ideological character of a particular populist movement or party. Weak, unconsolidated democracies are more likely to be damaged by populism. And populism of the far right or far left poses a graver danger to democracy than moderate centrist populism. And the kind of best examples, most well-known examples of far-right populism are those in Eastern Europe, that in Poland and in Hungary, that have followed out a master plan to undermine democracy through alteration of the constitution, laws, and politicization of the judiciary, the kind of erosion of judicial independence. So in the contemporary period, we do definitely see that populist movements threaten democracy, but it doesn't necessarily have to threaten democracy in all cases. So just kind of, first of all, looking at populism in Latin America, and then I'll look at populism in the United States, because populism has deep historical roots in both regions. And that's important to realize. And I think it gives us a kind of bigger view, a bigger picture of populism when we're talking about these specific countries. So in Latin America, there have been two periods of populism. The first was in the 1930s to the 1950s, beginning with the Great Depression, continuing into the 1950s. The best examples of populist leaders in this period were Juan Perón in Argentina, Vargas in Brazil, and to a lesser extent, Cardenas in Mexico. All of these leaders oversaw an attempt to industrialize their countries and really transform the economic and social character of their countries. This led to massive migration from rural areas into urban centers as opportunities for work in industry increased really dramatically. But of course, these new urban masses long for improved standards of living, and these populist leaders offered that to them. So this populism in the period of the 30s to the 50s really emphasized social justice and economic opportunity for the common people, but it was very much predicated on an attack of the pre-existing socioeconomic structure in Latin America, which was characterized by very high levels of inequality. So these leaders all attacked the agrarian oligarchs, foreign capital, all of the forces of history that had created inequality and poverty in their countries. So this populism had a kind of progressive character in that it was attempting to increase the well-being of the people. The new populisms of the 1960s to the present have different kinds of variants in terms of ideology. Some are progressive, some more to the left, some more to the right. But they share a common core in sort of being a backlash to traditional politicians and political parties. So there's widespread skepticism in Latin America to existing political parties, to economic elites, and a series of very large scandals that have contributed to the sense that the elite is corrupt. And the best known example of this is the Odebrecht scandal that took place in the mid-teens of the 21st century, and really implicated, I think it's something more than 13 Latin American countries and their elites in it, which showed that the firm Odebrecht had paid bribes on a very large scandal for construction projects across the region. And that scandal became very large, especially in Brazil, because Odebrecht is a Brazilian construction firm. And it also was interconnected with evidence that the Brazilian multinational energy company Paribas was also making large scale side payments to elites. So these corruption scandals have really undermined faith in existing political parties and leaders, and populist politicians have utilized that skepticism and loss of faith to win electoral support. Those scandals are compounded by or interconnected with neoliberal globalization and the kind of atomization of society and intense individual insecurity that often arises, particularly for the working class and parts of the middle class as well. Latin American states are not very strong. They've been weakened out by globalization. And we've also seen the rise of organized criminal networks across the region that really, in many ways, in certain circumstances, are as powerful as states or more powerful than states. And people have reacted very negatively to the growing inequality. So if we kind of summarize the background conditions in Latin America that have contributed to populism, there's a long tradition of presidentialism, which feeds right into kind of populist patterns of leadership, a tendency for populist leaders to remain in power for long periods of time, parties and politicians that keep others from participating in politics, a political culture that's very distrustful of institutions and also strong clientelistic patterns, and a political economy that has historically resulted in very unequal distribution of resources across social groups. So quickly look at Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. He is a former military leader. He was elected president of Brazil in 2018. He really looks back to the period of military dictatorship in Brazil. He utilizes racist, misogynistic, and homophobic tropes and diatribes to win support and sort of attack existing elites. In Latin America, he's referred to as the tropical Trump, and he's very, very similar to Donald Trump in a number of respects. He has come to power through an anti-corruption theme, and especially criticism of the Workers' Party, the PT, that was implicated in the big Odebrecht scandals. He articulates support for conservative and social values, and he particularly appeals to white men, evangelicals, and has built support among this new grassroots right wing within the country. And I can see that already it's 2:21, so I'm gonna have to figure out how to make this go faster. So Lopez Obrador is much more of a centrist populist, but he has also benefited from the crisis, the kind of prolonged crisis of Mexican society, the way in which crime is undermining integrity of the state or people's support for the state. He uses an anti-elite appeal. He is consolidating power that's very personalized, and he seeks to circumvent existing institutions and to really kind of rule directly through his relationship with the people. So he's very much a populist, but a centrist or even a center-left populist leader. Populism also has deep roots in the United States, and I don't have a ton of time to talk about those, but the 19th century agrarian populism was really the first populism in the world that appeared in the United States. Some people would link populism in Russia, but it's a very different kind of populism. So kind of true democratic populism first appeared in the United States in the 19th century. And the populist narrative was that the coastal urban elites were exploiting the hardworking, authentic Americans of the heartland. And that narrative has reappeared across American history since that time. More recently, in the anti-communist movements, the Red Scare of the 1940s and early 1950s, the Tea Party movement, to a lesser extent, the Occupy movement used some of the elements of the populist narrative. Here's a kind of picture that displays the populist narrative of the 19th century in the populist movement at the time. And Donald Trump really has revived that populist narrative, made it much stronger. Trump is kind of the quintessential populist leader to the extent that his rise to power was completely outside existing institutions. He never held public office before running for the White House. He never served in the military. That distinguishes him from all previous presidents. Rather, he came to power through becoming a TV celebrity in the show The Apprentice and through his Trump organization. And he has used a populist message very cleverly, very effectively to challenge the existing order. He is an outsider, a non-politician who would be able to fix the broken political system with his business acumen, make America great again by negotiating big deals to solve problems. He's depicted the political class, both Democrats and Republicans, as corrupt, incompetent, and out of touch with the average people. He's vowed to drain the swamp and railed about illegal immigration and growing social and ethnic diversity of American society. So we are all very familiar with the message of Donald Trump. And he has defied the norms, rules, and laws of US democracy, and continues to do so in the ongoing Stop the Steal movement, and which of course culminated in the January 6th insurrection. Okay, so in surveying these three countries, there's little doubt that populist leadership is a central feature of their contemporary politics. And then the remaining question is, has it taken root within the public as well? And we are conducting analyses of survey data from the Latin American Public Opinion Project to see what has happened at the level of the mass public in these three countries. And our hypotheses are that if we are truly seeing populism in the three countries, that significant proportions of the public have really embraced some aspects of the populist narrative. So we've examined the data to see whether that's so. We also expect that followers and supporters of populist presidents are more likely to adhere to dimensions of populist ideology than non-supporters. That the mass public that supports presidents will reflect the president's ideological position. We expect that there will be some similarities in the bases of support for these three leaders. And I'll just show you one table because I've already gone over time, but what we see here in this table is that in all three countries, there are widespread perceptions that corruption is a very serious problem and common, that politicians are extensively involved in corruption in all three countries. This is so, and relatively low levels of satisfaction with democracy and many other political institutions. Those who support the populist presidents in all three countries are supportive also of circumvention of existing institutions, including suspension of parliaments, suspending courts, and letting presidents rule directly. So to conclude, we find that major components of the populist narrative have been accepted by substantial proportions of the Brazilian, Mexican, and US publics. Populist tendencies are concentrated in the president's supporters and support groups. And this is particularly true in the United States, more so than in Mexico and Brazil. So this is a populist moment in history. Populism exists at both elite and mass level in all three countries. And our work is a first step toward a more comprehensive comparison of populism in the three countries. So thank you. And I'm sorry for running over so badly.
No worries, Judy. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. At this point, we will turn it over to Tim Hill, one of our student participants at this year's MIPSA conference. Take it away, Tim.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to, I'll say this is a pull the presentation up, but thank you for having me very much. Thanks very much for having me. I'm Timothy Hill. I'm an undergraduate senior at Aquinas College. I'm currently dual majoring in both history and political science, and this presentation will show that. I'm here today to present some, I guess, basic research on relating to the topic of authoritarianism, specifically a case study of it in the past. My presentation, let me pull this up for you guys. One second. Okay. All right. Can you guys see this okay? Is it showing? Okay. So let me know if for whatever reason it's not. But my, I guess, presentation here is titled Wilson's War on Dissent, and basically how the anti-war movement of World War I kind of faded into obscurity and was kind of crushed at the hands of the Woodrow Wilson administration. So when I say like the anti-war movement, that can mean quite a lot of things, but what do you typically think of when you first hear the term anti-war movement being used in a historical context? And I would probably, if I was a betting man, I'd wager you would probably say the Vietnam War. Now, granted, the Vietnam War is probably the biggest case of the anti-war movement we've seen, at least in American history. That kind of got me thinking at the beginning of sort of thinking about different research topics to do, and I kind of thought, well, what about World War I? Why wasn't there such a big anti-war movement there? Why didn't we see such a big explosion of people, you know, protesting in mass, or at least why didn't we learn about it in our history courses? So I kind of wondered a couple questions. Was there a major anti-war movement that grew in the U.S. Around the time of the First World War? And if so, why didn't it not grow to be as big as the anti-war movement in Vietnam, or at least why don't we talk about it as much as maybe we perhaps should? And this leads to my kind of overall thesis, which I found in doing this research that there had been a strong anti-war movement growing around the time of World War I. However, once Woodrow Wilson eventually drew us into war, he used his presidential powers to basically eliminate the anti-war movement and kind of punish and grow against dissent. So I think in relating to the topic of authoritarianism, that's sort of a big one, which we'll cover. So going into a bit of background, we have the election of 1916, and we have here Woodrow Wilson and Charles Evans Hughes as his running mate there. Now both, it was a close campaign. Woodrow Wilson, this was his second time running. He won his first election against both William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, who, when Teddy Roosevelt, he ran, created his own party, split the ticket, allowing Woodrow Wilson to basically take the presidency. So this was his second time running. Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican candidate. The Republicans tried to find a good candidate because obviously they wanted to avoid the split that occurred the previous election between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. And in doing so, they chose Charles Evans Hughes, who at first didn't really quite want to run, but eventually did after enough pressure. Charles Evans Hughes was actually I don't remember if he was Chief Justice, but he was a Supreme Court justice at the time. And so we think about like stepping down from the Supreme Court to run for president. That's quite interesting. I mean, imagine if Kavanaugh or Justice Roberts or something, you did that. That'd be crazy today in American public, but this was just something that was interesting. The election can kind of be seen as a referendum on whether or not to go to war in Europe. Now, this perhaps is a bit of a reductionist argument, but there were other issues that were on the campaign trail, including different antitrust legislation and kind of different reforms there. The women's peace movement was women's suffrage movement was kind of taking hold as well. And so there was a lot of other issues there. But by and large, the main absolute factor was this debate over war, whether or not to go join in the fighting. War had broken out, I believe, in 1914 in Europe, lots of infighting, and there was a big question kind of going around, is America going to get itself involved in this conflict? Now, Woodrow Wilson was basically seen as the anti-war candidate. He campaigned on the whole slogan, "He kept us out of war." Now, that doesn't necessarily make Hughes the pro-war candidate. He was mostly just a pro-preparedness candidate who wanted to be ready in the event of war. Now, Wilson was able to market him as a pro-war candidate, even though it was more so pro-preparedness. So in the election of 1916, Wilson does win a second term. But my big question is, like, kind of looking back at this, well, okay, he wins the election in 1916, being sworn back in March 5th of 1917. But strangely enough, we entered war in April of 1917. So how on earth could that be when the anti-war candidate just won his whole campaign? How not even a year later, we find ourselves in war with Europe? So something must have changed here. Why did we end up going to war when, Wilson got reelected? Doesn't make too much sense. So again, my kind of thoughts here is, well, what caused Wilson to essentially flip-flop? Now, I wonder, did Wilson change his mind? And I would say yes, over time. Of course, he had to sort of balance between diplomatic relations abroad and sort of public interest of the anti-war movement at home. Over time, of course, diplomatic relations with Germany began to sour. He eventually cut diplomatic ties with Germany in February of 1917, so just a little bit after he won the election. And that was following Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically Germany reinstituted a policy where if they found any ships aiding their enemies, they would not stop in terms of trying to get rid of them. So as a result, this targeted a lot of US ships, as well as obviously British ships, and a couple other countries as well. But the US really took this as like a personal insult, more or less, and eventually cut ties with Germany completely, at least diplomatically. Now, Wilson did come out and say that this didn't necessarily constitute any sort of wishing for war. He said he still wants to remain on good terms and be good friends with the nation of Germany and the Kaiser. But that seems a little bit interesting when you cut diplomatic relations. So obviously there's a growing public sentiment on, well, okay, we're cutting ties with Germany. Does that mean we're going to war? Would we? And Teddy Roosevelt actually wrote a couple days later saying, quote, "Whether we will really go to war or not, heaven only knows, and certainly Mr. Wilson doesn't." Obviously being critical of his opponent there. So the growing anti-war movement obviously began to grow as diplomatic ties to Germany looked more and more uncertain. There was a number of different organizations established. We had pacifist organizations, the Emergency Peace Federation and the Women's Peace Party. Those were two main anti-war groups that really showed their head at this time. There's also different lobbyist groups to persuade different lawmakers to push anti-war legislation. There were major protests and demonstrations, especially in large cities at the time. And the Socialist Party, which was actually gaining some traction, they ran a couple candidates in previous elections for president even. The Socialist Party made being anti-war a main party platform in 1916. And we will see a little bit more ties to that in a minute. But still, many pro-war voices became more outspoken. So there was a growing pro-war sentiment as well, most notably that of Teddy Roosevelt, who commented earlier. He was very hawkish on war, and Warren G. Harding, who was a senator at the time, would later become president afterwards. Warren G. Harding actually rejected a number of bills that were pushed by pro-war activists. He said he would not vote for them. He just could not on principle. And various newspapers as well were becoming more and more pro-war. And Americans were kind of divided still, now just because there was a growing pro-war movement and a growing anti-war movement does not necessarily make people inclined to pick one or the other. Obviously, people are still divided, very questioning. It's a very mixed bag issue. Now, the Zimmerman telegram came on April 1st, 1917. The Zimmerman telegram was a leaked document from Germany to Mexico, but intercepted, I believe, by the British and then shown to us, which very complicated web there, but it was essentially Germany saying, hey, we're going to give you, or saying to Mexico, hey, we're going to give you land back from the United States if you join us into war. And the U.S. took great offense to that, obviously. And Wilson's cabinet in the following days really pushed Wilson, hey, we need to go to war here. Germany is, trying to hurt us, and we've had enough. So war was officially declared on April 6th, 1917. That was the House and Senate voting on it. Wilson pushed for it a couple days sooner. And now that we found ourselves at war, doesn't mean that the anti-war protests and anti-war sentiment was all not the norm, I should say. So the majority of American citizens were still uneasy about war. I mean, they had just voted Wilson a couple months earlier, who campaigned on being anti-war through and through. And once we got ourselves into war, the pro-war side, I suppose, of the American public was not necessarily the dominant view, nor was it necessarily the only view. There's still much opposition, but how come we didn't hear about it at all? How come we haven't heard about it in our history classes as much as we do in Vietnam? Why did it not evolve into this big push for a whole real movement? And kind of going back to my main thesis here, which is Wilson explicitly wanted to get rid of the anti-war movement. It hurt him, obviously, both politically, but also anti-war sentiment. Once you get put into a war, you kind of want the public to be all in with you and also pro-war. So he wanted to get rid of this anti-war movement that was growing and continuing to gain support, although perhaps not at the rate as it did before. So he did this in three main ways. He established the Committee on Public Information. He instituted a Selective Service Act and also passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. I'll cover all of these, but these actions taken by Wilson really stomped on civil liberties and freedoms of American citizens as a whole. So the Committee on Public Information was essentially just straight up a propaganda wing. And I mean, we see this poster here, which is innocent enough. This is the Uncle Sam poster, iconic for its use in American, I guess, patriotic circles and sort of big pushes for pro-American speech and whatnot. And what we have to thank for that is this Committee on Public Information. Again, it was essentially a propaganda wing, which basically just worked to censor anti-war activity as well as push pro-war activity. A lot of anti-war like newspapers were sort of being censored by the United States government, or I guess part of this organization, and saying, hey, this is not right. Let's focus on war. Let's do this instead, is what the CPI basically kept saying. It pushed a lot of anti-German sentiment as well, obviously to get the public more stirred up for war. Germany obviously being the main sort of antagonist, I suppose, of the World War One. CPI really pushed a lot of anti-German sentiment, a lot of German hate. As a result, I mean, a lot of like German streets were renamed in the US, a lot of foods even, a lot of German just things were completely renamed in order to make them more patriotic. And so a lot of people, as a result, faced a lot of, I suppose, hate. German Americans, I should say, especially during this time. Especially just given the fact that they sort of did not deserve it as much as because they are Americans. They just happen to be from Germany. So a lot of like ethnic, or I should say, a lot of name changes were instituted from people's last names based on this time period. The Committee on Public Information was also created 8 days after the war vote passed, which you think, wow, that's quick. That's pretty quick to act. And it was created by executive order. So this was a government office created by Woodrow Wilson, basically to get as much propaganda as he could out there concerning the war. Moving on to the Selective Service Act, that was, again, just a mandatory draft imposed. And that basically faced the same war as the problems in the Vietnam War. It was a very unpopular draft among the public. There were a lot of draft dodgers and forced enlistment. It passed in May 1917. So again, keeping in this kind of time frame, that's just a month after we declared war. I suppose Selective Service Acts were kind of the norm at the time, but we think of this today perhaps as a very, horrible thing, like what we see in the Vietnam War, where we can't believe that, the government would mandatorily have people sign up for these drafts and make them go to war, especially at such a young age, against their will. And this was just the precursor to that. About roughly 3 million men never registered, which is about 15% of the 24 million who did. So obviously this isn't necessarily the biggest draft dodging rate, but 15% is still significant. Also, draft cards were burned this in a similar fashion. I don't think people necessarily fled to Canada to escape the draft or anything, as they would in the Vietnam War, but history doesn't quite repeat itself, but it often rhymes, I think, is the Mark Twain quote. The Espionage Act and Sedition Acts were passed in June 1917 and May of 1918, respectively. These acts made it illegal basically to criticize the government or to say or do anything that may harm the war effort. And that's quite broadly worded and is so on purpose in order to kind of be a catch-all for helping to squash dissent. We think of the anti-war movement as being these big protesters which are trying to stand up for what they believe in terms of, hey, we need to get out of war here. And the government wing here under the Espionage and Sedition Acts strictly made it illegal. Eugene Debs was a prominent socialist party leader. He ended up getting jailed or imprisoned for 10 years because he was so outspoken against the war. In part, he also encouraged people to draft dodge, burn their draft cards, not serve, not comply, essentially, and was in prison for 10 years. Wilson himself called him an enemy of the people and of the country, which is quite authoritarian rhetoric. But also, too, I think, goes to show you that, yeah, he was in prison for voicing a public opinion. He would later run for president in the next election, I believe, from prison. So that was pretty interesting. A dangerous thing, too, is the Supreme Court actually upheld these acts, and I think this is where we get our fire in a crowded theater quote from. Basically, the Supreme Court said it's okay to have these acts instituted so long as there is a necessity for them to be instituted, and war, of course, being one of them. So this obviously had major implications for our individual freedoms, like rights to free speech and expression of ideas. It basically made it illegal to be anti-war. And I'll end off here in just a second because I know we're pressed for time. But overall, my conclusion to this is sort of that the anti-war movement began rather strongly, and then later dwindled in support a little bit as America's relationship with Germany became uneasy. Following the severance of diplomatic ties, there were several calls for peace, but then Wilson finally urged to declare war, following several U.S. ships being sunk and obviously the Zimmerman telegram being intercepted. And then secondly, upon declaring war, Wilson instituted a number of measures to minimize dissent, establishment of a propaganda committee, creation of a mandatory draft, and signing into law the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Majorly infringed on the rights of the individual rights of individual citizens, limiting their ability to criticize and voice any sentiments of rebellion against the war effort or against the war. To be against the war essentially began to be against the United States, was sort of the thinking there. In the end, the peace candidate from 1916, Woodrow Wilson, went on to declare war on Germany just a year later and went to war with the peace advocates, whose views he once shared in 1918. Now, I want to connect this to kind of current implications. Real quick here, yeah, there's the Mark Twain quote, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." We need to kind of take examples from this, and we can learn from the past and use it to impact our future. I think that's kind of what we do as historians, but we should do this as political science students as well. And let's take this as sort of a warning against any sorts of encroachments on our individual liberties and freedoms. And this example obviously is implicating free speech, but we should be more inclusive to other rights and liberties we have as citizens as well. And I want to say thank you for listening. Again, I'm Timothy Hill, student of Aquinas College. If you have any thoughts or questions after this presentation, my email is down there below, 18hilt@db@gmail.com. Thank you guys very much.
Fabulous. Thanks, Tim, very much for another excellent presentation. At this point, we can open it up to questions from the audience. If you feel free to unmute yourself and ask away, or if you like, type it in the chat and I'll ask it.
Well, Judy, I'll start. I have a question for you. I'm wondering about the relationship between populism and neo-fascism, and if you've considered looking into that literature.
Yes, a little bit. I think it's important to distinguish between them. So there's a tendency to kind of conflate the two terms in the contemporary discussion of populism. And parties that really are fascist are occasionally referred to as populist. Okay, so one thing I would say that distinguishes populism from fascism is its general embrace of democratic principles, and whereas fascism often explicitly rejects some of the core elements of democratic ideology. So for a populist movement to be genuinely populist, we should not see within its ideology explicit rejection of democracy. I think that's really the dividing line. So some of the right-wing parties in Europe that are often referred to as populist parties are in fact fascist. Do you agree, Roger? And do you teach about populism in your comparative politics classes, or?
Well, yeah, but I'm recently very interested in the conversation about neo-fascism, and just operationalizing the differences clearly. But neo-fascism is rearing its ugly head all over the place right now.
Yes.
And one of the things we know from Roger Griffin's work, among others, is that fascism is, as you said, relative to populism, different depending on time and place. And so, Italian fascism in the early 1920s was different than Italian fascism in the 1930s, was different than German fascism in the 1940s, which was different than Franco's fascism. So operationalizing neo-fascism has been something I've been working on, and I'm not sure I have a handle on it yet. So I was curious to see what you said.
That's interesting.
Other questions or comments are welcomed.
Yeah, I agree that Donald Trump campaigned in 2016 as a populist, and there was a lot about his initial term in office as populist. But I think by the end, and certainly now, the Republican Party has devolved into a fascist or neo-fascist party. I mean, they certainly have rejected believing that in democratic elections. They don't trust the outcome. They don't believe in the free popular press in the United States. They see it all as lies. Anything that's not the voice of the party, voice of the leader, is all lies. They won't have it. They've embraced violence. Those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th are lifted up as heroes. Donald Trump certainly endorsed violence throughout his presidency when he told people who'd rough up the press at his rallies that he'd pay for their legal bills. He told police to give people a rough ride. I mean, he hasn't really hid his embrace of violence. And you're seeing paramilitary organizations associated with the Republican Party literally terrorize local elected officials and school boards, and of course he wants to deport 11 million people who are undocumented workers, non-citizens, and yet some of those citizens were brought here at 3 months old. I mean, they've never known any other country. I mean, they're really Americans in all but name. And and people say, well, it's not fascism like Germany because it's not anti-Semitic. They're not against the Jews. And my response to that is, well, if the Jews were not citizens of the United States, and if they were here without permission, then they would have to go, correct? And they're like, yeah, everybody who's not here without permission and any non-citizens have to go. And I remind them that Jews were not citizens of Nazi Germany. And so, they don't like hearing that. But then you ask, well, what happens to them? Well, they have to be deported. And if no other country would take them, then what to do with them? Can they stay? Usually, categorically, the answer to people I've talked to, even in my own family, is no. They all have to go.
So I don't know if what you're asking is, should we be calling Donald Trump and the Republican Party fascists? Is that really essentially what you're asking? Instead of labeling them populists?
At this point, I do. I mean, they don't believe in elections. They're intent on trying to.
I don't think they would say that they don't believe in elections. They want an election process that guarantees. So what makes them populist is that they give a kind of preference to the people that they consider to be the true, genuine people. And you're absolutely right about the xenophobia and this kind of attempt to distinguish between people who are true Americans and those who, are really don't belong here or shouldn't be here. So they want to restore kind of power to who they consider to be the true Americans. And to that extent, they have combined populism with a kind of ethno-nationalism. So it is a far-right populism, but I don't think it's fascism. Not yet. There are fascist tendencies, and there are certainly fellow travelers in the Trump coalition that we could identify as fascist. But I don't think you could say that the modal Trump voter is a fascist, or that the Trump movement on the whole is a fascist movement. I don't think that's an accurate statement.
They're not all fascists, but there's the Oscar Schindlers in there as well. I mean, but every problem facing this country is blamed on foreigners overseas who are screwing us, foreigners within our midst who don't belong here who are undermining us. I mean, this is the rhetoric you hear from them.
Right, but so that's why I think the historical perspective is important, because there have been these populist movements in earlier periods of American history, and looking at those populist movements helps us, I think, understand what's going on right now, and especially the xenophobia, and anti-Semitism, which was very much a part of earlier populist movements in the United States, anti-immigrant sentiment, and implicit racism. These have long been part of the populist mentality in the United States, and when populism has appeared historically. So it's really not anything new. I mean, that I'm not trying to justify it or say that it's good in any way, but it's definitely part of the American historical tradition.
Yeah. Well, I'm scared. Clearly you don't seem frightened, but I'm frightened.
No, I'm not saying it. I'm not frightened. I think there's a real danger that populism can lead to a collapse of democracy. There's no doubt about that. And that Trump has really undermined democratic institutions in the United States. I'm happy to share the paper with you, and I think if you read the paper, you would see that we are very concerned, but we're also trying to, kind of adopt the political science perspective and think about this in a very consistent theoretical way, and to use the tools of political science to examine what's happening in the United States, Brazil, and Mexico.
Well, thank you. I'll read anything that talks me off the ledge. Thank you.
Okay.
I think we can take one more question. Going once, going twice.
I'll ask Tim a question.
Okay, go ahead, Judy. That's
okay. Good. So Woodrow Wilson, he has played such an ambiguous role in American history in many respects. Did you look at his relationship to the Ku Klux Klan at all in his presidency, and his sort of encouragement of white supremacy in the South?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole debate or not debate. I mean, obviously that wasn't, it's a historical fact that he was very sympathetic to the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, he even streamed, I think not streamed, they didn't have streaming back then. Showed the film Birth of a Nation in the White House, right. Which is a very white supremacist, very Ku Klux Klan propaganda film. Obviously, he had a big relationship there, very sympathetic, a lot of personal ties as well. That wasn't necessarily a, I guess, topic on the presentation, but yeah, Woodrow Wilson in all of his craziness, I guess you could say, throughout American history, all of his implications throughout history. His explicit racism should not be understated. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
I asked that question is kind of in connection with what Keith was asking. American history is
not pretty.
No.
Right. We've had our moments, for sure.
And Trump was a terrible president, but there were a lot of other terrible presidents.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think a lot of people hyperbolize, I think, current politics on both sides, of course, but I think things used to be a lot worse than they were today.
Well, thank you everybody for attending the panel. It was great to have everybody and to hear these great presentations. As a member of the MIPSA executive board, I know the board is pleased that we were able to continue the streak, if you will, of holding an annual meeting, even if it was virtual and not together like we all want it to be. And I'll just echo Judy's comments from before and thanking John Clark from Western Michigan University for his over-the-top efforts to make sure that this came off. And we hope to see everybody in person next year if we can make that happen and have a MIPSA that we're more used to. So thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for having us.